At this point, we all know the tale of Final Fantasy Versus XIII and Final Fantasy XV, and how Versus XIII was a game that tragically was never meant to be. Kind of? I mean, the jury is still out on that one. But what if I told you there was a third Final Fantasy XV that was once planned, and was never confirmed until recently? And you'll want to hit that subscribe button because this channel uncovers all of the secrets of Final Fantasy. And this one is pretty major, and is sadly something now that can never become a reality. This was recently confirmed by a person whose French name I would likely butcher as an English speaker, so I'm just going to put it on the screen, that was actually leaked by user Super Bunny Hop a few years ago, but couldn't be confirmed explicitly until now. All the way back in 2011 when Final Fantasy Versus XIII was still Versus XIII, and there was yet no Final Fantasy XV, Eidos Montreal wanted to make an RPG that was heavily inspired by Final Fantasy. Eventually, the team entered talks with former Square Enix president Yoichi Wada, with the game's concept eventually evolving into Final Fantasy XV. That's right, before Versus was scrapped and remolded as Final Fantasy XV, the original plan was to make the 15th mainline entry the first Western-developed Final Fantasy game, and this project would become known as Project W. Though from the description of the game, it's something that sounded more like Star Ocean, as it was actually supposed to be a space opera RPG. They were also working on a brand new game engine that allowed for seamless takeoffs and landings between planets, meaning in this game you're going to be able to hop in your airship, or should I say spaceship, and fly off to other planets and explore the reaches of space. Sounds kind of awesome, actually. The main protagonist was going to be searching for a love interest named Nova, but was going to meet another female warrior along the way, creating a love triangle, creating a good level of tension between them as they would go on their adventure. Now, of course, this all sounds really awesome, but clearly we did not get the game, and Final Fantasy XV does not have space travel. So what went wrong? When the project was pitched to the Japanese executives in 2012, the idea was rejected by them, likely because 2012 is the same year they decided to scrap and retool Versus XIII into what is now known as FF15. This came after 6 years of development issues with Versus XIII at this point, mostly due to things like crystal tools, the disaster of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 and team having to be pulled off of the game, among numerous other issues. It seems likely to me that once this decision was made, they no longer had a need for Project W. Even though the project would go on for another year, gaining the new name Project Nova, it was still eventually cancelled. So I think this is an incredibly fascinating concept for a Final Fantasy game. In fact, with the occasional Final Fantasy game allowing us to go to the moon, I thought that at some point we would eventually explore space in the series. I also think that there is a general need for a higher budget version of Star Ocean, a JRPG that does let us explore space, but have the sort of production behind it that a Final Fantasy game would have, as that's likely what would be required to make such a massive game in scope happen. And I also think it'd be cool to see something that was sort of a JRPG answer to Mass Effect. And it's also that same monetary reason that a project like this was cancelled. Developing a space opera RPG from the way they describe it, where you take off and go to other planets, and are, from what I can tell based on the description, able to just sort of dynamically land on them. This game sounds like it was going to be absolutely massive in budget, and the only way for something like that to ever survive would probably be to have a big name behind it like Final Fantasy. Of course, now there is zero likelihood of this project ever being revived, as Eidos Montreal no longer belongs to Square Enix, but I do think that creating a Final Fantasy game like this would generate a ton of excitement. It's also kind of insane the fact that this is the second Western Final Fantasy that has been in development and was then cancelled. Will a Final Fantasy game that is ever developed by the West ever happen? It seems much more unlikely now that Square has sold off their Western studios, but it still doesn't outrule the possibility, as Square is always outsourcing projects to new developers. And while I want Final Fantasy to remain a primarily Japanese developed game series, I still would not mind seeing a spin-off or some other title being developed by a Western studio. But that's just my thoughts on it, and I want to hear yours in the comments below. Shout out to patron Cameron McDonald and the rest of the Ultima community.